The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Five primaries yesterday for the Democrats, five primaries for the Republicans. Let's start with the Democrats, where Hillary Clinton won four. Let's take a look at the results. In Connecticut, Hillary winning by a margin of 5 percentage points. In Delaware, Hillary up 60-39, winning 60-39. Maryland, a dominant victory, 63-33 over Bernie Sanders. In Pennsylvania, a narrower victory, 56-44. And in Rhode Island, Bernie's lone win yesterday, 55-43. Lewis, were you surprised at the results, either in terms of the number of states that each candidate won or in terms of the margins of victory?
No, going into this, it's pretty much how I thought it would play out.
So let's take a look at where the delegate numbers from yesterday specifically, and you will notice that with proportional allocation of delegates, even in some states that Hillary Clinton won, the delegate difference was quite small. For example, in Connecticut, Hillary Clinton winning the state, but grabbing 27 delegates compared to Bernie Sanders' 24. In Delaware, again, Hillary won, picking up 12 delegates, Bernie Sanders 9. Maryland was a big one for Hillary, where she picked up 53 delegates, more than twice the 24 delegates that Bernie Sanders added. Pennsylvania, 91-59, the delegate allocation, according to an estimate from an hour ago from New York Times. And Rhode Island, Bernie's lone win, only a 13-11 delegate victory. Yesterday, total 194 new delegates for Hillary Clinton, 129 new delegates for Bernie Sanders. And thus, the big picture question now is, well, where does that get us in terms of the race to 2383? I mean, Lewis, that's what matters at this point, isn't it?
That seems to be the most important number. So far.
Let's look at those numbers indeed. Hillary Clinton now estimated at 1,640 delegates, needing 743 more to hit that magic number. Bernie Sanders, 1,331 delegates, needing 1,052. And the New York Times, and this is complex. The superdelegate estimate for the New York Times currently for Hillary Clinton, 519, and Bernie Sanders, 39. And there's no reasonable way to discuss this if we say, well, listen, we can't count superdelegates because they don't vote until the convention. Well, that's not really representative of what each candidate needs to do. If we include them in the total delegate counts, people say, hey, those are not pledged delegates and they haven't voted yet, so it doesn't make sense to include them at this time. So we've gone with what the New York Times does, Lewis, which is separating them and noting where they are sort of estimated, although, of course, that can change. They can typically do whatever it is that they want. So there's really no breathing room whatsoever left here for Bernie Sanders. He has fallen further behind. We have Indiana upcoming, West Virginia upcoming, Kentucky, Oregon. Those are pretty small states. I mean, until California, the day California votes, June 7th, New Jersey also votes. And those are really, really big. And as of right now, if Bernie Sanders got 100% of the delegates in California and New Jersey, he would take a commanding lead. But there's no evidence whatsoever to suggest that Bernie Sanders is even going to get 70 or 75% of those delegates. No poll suggests that that could happen. Bernie currently polling 42% in California and 42% in New Jersey. So what are the takeaways here? The argument that Hillary is merely a regional candidate is evaporating. These were wins outside of the Deep South yesterday. Bernie's argument for staying in, though, I believe is still strong, Lewis. We'll get to the Republican race. John Kasich has won a single state, and he is still in this thing. Bernie Sanders has 1,300 delegates. If Bernie Sanders is indeed not the eventual nominee, 1,300 or 14 or 15 or 1,600, whatever the number ultimately is for Bernie, this will be one of the most successful non-winning primary runs in a long time. And that is going to have an impact. The movement that has been created here, if it goes no further, is no doubt hugely important.
Yeah, and I know people don't like it. Bernie supporters don't like it when we say it's not looking good for Bernie. We talk about the numbers, but it really is important for Bernie to stay in, to keep giving speeches, to keep getting his message across, because that's what we need. We need
No
people.
doubt.
Yeah, and so he should stay in, yes, without a doubt.
On the Republican side, Donald Trump, 5 for 5 against Ted Cruz and John Kasich in the April 26th primaries. Let's take a look at the results, Lewis. In Connecticut, Trump 58 to 12% for Cruz and 29 for Kasich. Dominant in Delaware, Trump 61 to Cruz's 16 and Kasich's 20. Commanding in Maryland, 54 for Trump to Cruz and Kasich's 19 and 23. Supreme. And in Pennsylvania and Rhode Island, 57 and 64% respectively for Donald Trump. Nothing short of authoritative. And where do the delegates stand now? That is the question for everybody to look at. Well, Donald Trump picking up 105 delegates yesterday puts him at 949. Ted Cruz picking up 1. That is not a typo. 1 delegate yesterday, getting him to 544. Marco Rubio has not relinquished his 171 delegates, but he is no longer in the race. Picked up none yesterday, of course. And John Kasich actually doing better than Ted Cruz, now up to 153 delegates with the 5 that he added on April 26th. 1237, the magic number for Republicans. What are the takeaways here? Well, Trump has set a new high watermark for him. He averaged 59% support in the 5 states that voted yesterday. His average margin of victory was 35%. What argument can Ted Cruz and John Kasich reasonably make here other than, listen, we don't want Trump to be the nominee? And if they're going to make that argument, increasingly they have to make the argument by saying he's not going to defeat Hillary or Bernie, because the argument that he's not the presumptive leader is evaporating quickly.
Yeah, they can make all the arguments they want. I don't see, there's no good reason why Cruz or Kasich should become the nominee. It's got to be Trump. It should be Trump. Let democracy work. The party doesn't want that to happen. They don't want it to happen. Cruz will stay in. Well,
Ted Cruz, by the way, and because of the timing of our show, Ted Cruz has announced that he's going to be making a major campaign announcement later today. That announcement may have happened by the time you were listening to or watching this.
Yeah.
It's assumed that it's going to be a running mate announcement, which would be very bizarre to make in April, to be perfectly honest with you, and that it may be Carly Fiorina. We don't exactly know. It crossed my mind maybe Cruz is just going to drop out, but
I doubt it.
I don't know that his ego would allow that at this point.
Exactly. He does have quite the ego. It's just a desperate move. It's he's in a bad situation. He thinks it might help. Well, he really has nothing to lose at this point.
I want to explain to you both how Donald Trump is winning and how clueless his supporters are and how much of a ruse this entire thing is. I was looking at exit polls yesterday from the April 26th primary, and I looked at, to start, Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania had voters in the Republican primary who described themselves as, quote, very conservative, voting most often for Trump. To put it another way, Trump won the people who consider themselves very conservative in Pennsylvania. In Maryland, Trump won the very conservative voters by even more, with 54% of the very conservative vote. In Connecticut, Trump won the very conservative vote by even more, Lewis, with 55% of that vote. Think about the absurdity here, and I'm going to lay this all out. Donald Trump has said that while he's against abortion, supposedly, who really believes that Planned Parenthood has done, quote, very good work for millions of women. And he won the very conservative vote of Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Connecticut at minimum, probably in all the states. I didn't even get to look at all of the states. This is not a view that any so-called very conservative Republican would ever say out loud, if at all. Donald Trump's position on Middle East intervention is basically indistinguishable from that of Bernie Sanders, which is a non-interventionist position with regard to going in and toppling Middle East dictators. Donald Trump's position on infrastructure spending domestically is closest, Lewis, to that of Bernie Sanders, wanting to spend on infrastructure. There is very little that could be described as very conservative about Donald Trump's positions. Yes, he wants to ban Muslim travel to the U.S. That's less about being very conservative than it is about a combination of blatant xenophobia, nativism, and authoritarianism, right? There's nothing by definition conservative about that plan, or the plan to build this outrageously expensive wall and the outrageously expensive idea of deporting 11 to 12 million undocumented immigrants. Those things are less conservative than they are authoritarian. And yet Donald Trump is winning the very conservative vote. So what are the possibilities that explain this? Well, there's the possibility that it's personality, right? Trump is just a personality candidate. His political positions are essentially secondary. His supporters know they don't share that much agreement with Donald Trump, but that they like his personality or his energy or whatever. Or maybe people are drawn to Trump because of his high personal income. It's more about he's rich and he might make me rich. And even though there's no evidence supporting this, a good business person would be a good president or something like that. So I don't care about the fact that he's as liberal as Bernie on a lot of different issues. And there's the third possibility, which is Republican voters are just clueless. They think Trump is very conservative. They don't have the realization that his positions match those of Bernie Sanders on many issues, obviously not nearly all. How can the Republican Party explain having a nominee with these positions to the left of Hillary Clinton on more than one issue, and saying this is what our party wants? They either have to say, Lewis, that this is some kind of ruse, that it is directed by, I don't know, hating Hillary Clinton in some way, or that their voters are clueless.
We know the voters are clueless, but my takeaways from this are that those who identify as the most conservative are the most clueless, and not just about Trump and his policies, but about everything, really everything.
Interesting.
Anything you can possibly think of, any topic. And the other thing is that it seems that for the most conservative people, the number one issue for them, let's just assume they know a handful of things about politics. The most important issue for them is getting rid of Mexicans and Muslims. Right?
I don't know. That's the thing that doesn't make sense to me, because on paper, Trump's ideas related to those issues aren't conservative, certainly not fiscally. They're the complete opposite of that. So is it ideologically that the voters are so concerned with getting rid of Mexicans and Muslims, Latin Americans, Latinos, however you cross-section it, that they don't care about the lack of fiscal conservatism? I mean, is that what you're suggesting?
Yes, exactly, because that's what they're most afraid of. And fear rules their lives.
Send me your thoughts on this. How on earth are the very conservative Republicans voting disproportionately for Donald Trump? Lewis is on Twitter at Lewis Motamedi. I'm on Twitter at dpacman. Let me know.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's David Pakman Show member of the day is Tracy Barber. Tracy, thank you so much for being a David Pakman Show member. You can sign up at davidpakman.com/membership. Membership is the #1 funding source for this show. The broadcast show has always been free. It will always be free, but it is supported by members. And I invite you to get all the great member benefits and sign up at davidpakman.com/membership. Hatriot Mail this week tackles an issue that we have tackled before, but what is Hatriot Mail anyway?
It's like email forwards from your racist grandma on steroids. Hatriot Mail. Written by patriots who hate David Pakman.
Right.
Because America. And because freedom.
Okay, let's get into this week's Hatriot Mail. As I mentioned, it is a topic that we have touched before. It is a topic that Hatriots have touched before, and we'll address it after you listen to this.
Unsubscribed. You're a fucking idiot. Instead of going on and on about racial disparities, try discussing actual facts, such as the fact that black people comprise 13% of the U.S. population and commit over 52% of all murder nationwide.
This is a common refrain, right, Lewis? Hey, there are way fewer black people and they commit a ton of crime per capita. And therefore, black people are just inherently dangerous and bad people, I think a lot of Hatriots would suggest. This Hatriot and many others ignore some very, very serious realities. If a black person and a white person each commit a crime, the black person is more likely to be arrested. And this is due in part to the fact that black neighborhoods, traditionally black neighborhoods, are more heavily policed. Individual non-white people, this applies to Latinos as well, are more heavily policed. And then you follow this, the individuals who are not white are more likely to be indicted, prosecuted, found guilty, and given harsher prison sentences. When a non-white person in the U.S. is arrested for a crime, they are convicted more often than white people arrested for the same crime. When non-white people in the U.S. are convicted of a crime, they are also more likely to be sentenced to incarceration compared to white people convicted of the same crime. And this, Lewis, doesn't even consider the poverty element, which is separate but inextricably linked in this country to race, given the history of the United States, which we'll talk about in the interview shortly. So I think it's Hatriot Mail, of course. We often don't respond too specifically to it, but because this idea keeps coming up from a lot of right-wing nuts, I think it's good to address it a little more specifically.
On a side note, I just want to applaud this Hatriot on their grammar.
Right.
It was really great use of grammar, David. And you don't see that on too many Hatriot Mails.
No, it's certainly rare, and that we can all appreciate. State Senator Buck Newton, apparently his real name, is a Republican candidate running to become North Carolina's Attorney General. He said a couple of days ago when talking about this controversial transgender bathroom law in North Carolina that, quote, "we must fight to keep our state straight." I have audio and I have video of him saying this.
Go home. Tell your friends and family who had to work today what this is all about and how hard we must fight to keep our state straight. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So this law made North Carolina the first state in the country that requires transgender people to use restrooms in public buildings that match the genitalia that they are born with. Of course, if you're born intersex, good luck figuring out what bathroom Buck Newton wants you to be using. He also went on to say that it is absolutely very, very important that we maintain. He threw. I don't even. It's actually eluding me now. He went on and talked more about the Bible, and he's a religious guy. Anyway, the key point here is after this blew up, Buck Newton said, "No, this isn't at all about being anti-trans or anti-gay or anything like that. This has nothing to do with homosexuality," which is so absurd. If you make a statement that you need to maintain the heterosexuality of your state, that's sort of by definition about homosexuality and about transgender rights or whatever. And the scariest part of this is that saying they need to keep North Carolina straight might actually help them become attorney general. And that should be disturbing to any clear thinking individual.
Yeah, I still think he might have used the word straight, not meaning in terms of your, sexual preference or whatever.
You've got to be an idiot if that's what you're doing. Talking about a law related to these issues.
Of course this is an idiot, Dave.
Yeah, well, okay.
All right, come on. This guy's an idiot. But I don't think he meant straight in the way we normally use the words gay and straight.
Well, he said by keep our state straight, he meant
in order.
Keep men out of the ladies' room.
That's true. That is true. But I really do think he just meant keep our state in order. Now, I am not saying that this man is not clearly a bigot and an idiot. And
well, he did go on to compare transgender people to people who are addicted to drugs.
Yes. And so, yeah, he's a scumbag. But I just wanted to add that.
As usual, much bigger fish to fry in North Carolina. But this guy who wants to be attorney general is talking about keeping men out of the ladies' room and keeping the state straight. North Carolina, one of the worst funded education systems, ranks 31st in health rankings, 24th in school system quality, 24th in obesity, below the national average in household income, below the national average in individual per capita income. So the issue is, Lewis, genitalia in public bathrooms. Why not, right?
Yeah, whatever you think will get you reelected. I don't know.
This is barely making headlines, but Malaria and yellow fever are becoming a bigger and bigger crisis in South Africa. Angola specifically is having a real problem with malaria. Back in 2014, 5,500 people in Angola died of malaria. In 2015, that number grew to 8,000. And in the first quarter of 2016 alone, that number is nearly 3,000. The WHO's Angola representative, Hernando Ospina, said this new malaria outbreak has devastated the entire country. Even in provinces that have low endemic prevalence, we are seeing the spread and surge in cases. What is causing this? Well, Ospina from the WHO said uncollected garbage in Luanda due to government budget cuts is contributing to the problem. A record high amount of rainfall has contributed to more malaria as well as yellow fever. Malaria is a mosquito-borne disease caused by parasites. The symptoms include fever, chills, flu-like illness, and if you leave it untreated, it can cause severe complications and death. In the United States, there are about 1,500 or so cases of malaria diagnosed each year, and most of them are in travelers who have been to countries where malaria transmission is occurring, many of those sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia. Angola is the 7th largest country in Africa, huge petroleum reserves, very quickly growing economy, but Lewis, a very low standard of living, because by and large, that economic growth from petroleum, as we have seen happen the world over, is heavily concentrated among the richest individuals. And life expectancy and infant mortality are some of the worst in the world in Angola.
Malaria is really nasty, and it's a really nasty problem over there. It's one of those things that has become kind of politicized because there are those who are saying, look, we can get these people what they need to help them deal with malaria.
Right.
We have the resources. Why isn't this happening? And it's a source of a lot of debate. And
in addition to just malaria, there is also a yellow fever outbreak, smaller, but it is happening. The Angola yellow fever outbreak has killed 258 people since December of 2015, just in the last 5 months. Sometimes people get confused between malaria and yellow fever because both are transmitted by mosquitoes, but the difference is malaria is caused by a parasite transmitted by mosquitoes, whereas yellow fever is actually a virus that you get from the mosquito. So related in some sense, but different conditions. This is actually an opportunity for the U.S. to get involved now and help. And as Lewis said, it has become very politicized. Instead of debating whether we should be the world's policeman, what about being the world's doctor when appropriate, when affordable, when we can make an impact, which we clearly could here?
Yeah, well, I guess it's just more important to spend trillions of dollars on pointless wars.
Is that what you think? That's what is at the root of this? The defense industrial paradigm?
Well, that's what our presidents and lawmakers have decided, right?
You know what could get us very much involved? If Rand Paul comes out and says any second we're going to have a malaria outbreak in the U.S., and then you get a couple people on Fox News, so-called experts, saying ban all travel to and from Angola, that would be the way to get people in the United States to pay attention to this. And I will remind you, and I'm not suggesting this will become the Ebola thing, we started talking about Ebola 6 months before it became prevalent in the United States, not in terms of actual contagion, but in terms of media discussion. And at the time, nobody wanted to talk about it. Nobody cared about it on corporate media because it wasn't yet affecting the United States. You can be sure at the point at which there is even fear-mongering about this affecting the United States, Obama will be talking about it. All of a sudden, we'll be involved.
Yeah, well, maybe we should light that fire right now and just tell people that it's happening here. See if it catches.
Give us a like on Facebook, facebook.com/David Pakman Show. We will take a quick break. Very interesting and important interview coming up.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
I'm joined by Peter Enns today, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Government at Cornell University and author of the book Incarceration Nation: How the United States Became the Most Punitive Democracy in the World. We've talked about mass incarceration and the U.S. in context of the world in that mass incarceration area. And often the angle you take on this issue is not discussed. And that's that the move towards mass incarceration that we've seen over the last 40 years has at least in part been a response to the U.S. as a society becoming more punitive. How did you first start looking into this or get this idea?
Yeah, so you're exactly right, David, with looking at the importance of public opinion. And at first, so when you mention what people typically talk about, we often think of the legal system, the criminal justice system, as insulated from public opinion. But I was thinking of all the ways public opinion can influence criminal justice and the incarceration rate in particular. And we often don't realize how much legislators and their political decisions influence things like the incarceration rate by determining how various crimes are sentenced, affecting mandatory sentencing requirements. And then these legislators, who of course depend on being elected, they allocate the budget that influences the capacity to incarcerate. So there's a lot of mechanisms there where the public influence gets translated into the criminal justice system.
And in your book, you sort of trace the path of what, as you describe, for several decades, an increase in the generally punitive nature or opinions of the American public, and then more recently describe the sort of decrease in that punitive nature and how that now is becoming a factor. Let's start first with the rise in what you describe as the punitive nature of the American people. What caused that, and in what ways was it reflected?
Sure. Because the overtime patterns you're describing are so important, because we often just hear the country described, oh, the public's punitive, or oh, they want this. And the overtime changes are really meaningful and important. And in the 1960s, the crime rate starts to increase. We see increasing media coverage of this rising crime rate. That translates into a rising public punitiveness. And this process continues through the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And it's the mid-1990s when we observe the high point of the public's punitiveness in this country.
That, of course, is sort of undeniable. But what I would love to hear you elaborate on a little bit would be the role of propaganda in this on public opinion. Because, of course, we can look at crime rates, but the crime rates alone won't tell us about, for example, disproportionate policing of areas either based on income or race. It won't talk to us about fear-mongering and Ronald Reagan's infamous stories about criminality and welfare queens and so many other things. So in doing this analysis, how do you sort of account for the propaganda effect that is sort of inherent in American politics?
Sure. You raised a lot of interesting and very important issues there. So mentioning the role of race and racial considerations, which is so important for trying to understand criminal justice and incarceration in this country. Social class plays in. And then you mentioned propaganda. And one very, perhaps even surprising finding is what I found was, I don't know that I would classify it as propaganda, but in terms of media coverage of crime, what we typically see and what those who have researched media coverage of crime, we find over coverage of violent crimes. So disproportionate focus on violent crimes, disproportionate focus on crimes committed by racial minorities, and almost always this focus on the very particularistic, narrow nature of the crime, as opposed to the bigger picture, how does society deal with crime, or what policies would lead to reductions in crime. So on the one hand, that might be sort of fall under what you're describing as propaganda. Others have simply described it as if it bleeds, it leads. But this is the pattern of media coverage, and this is partly why when the crime rate goes up and media coverage of crime goes up, it translates into rising public punitiveness.
And can you talk a little bit about how that was sort of taken advantage of by elected officials to move us in the direction of the mass incarceration status quo that we now are all too familiar with?
Sure, because it was these political decisions that had such an important effect on the rise of mass incarceration. And what we see was these political leaders were following shifts in the public's punitiveness. And we often think of political leaders, so we hear Barry Goldwater and his campaign, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan. These names are often brought up, but when we look at what they were doing and shifts in public opinion, and a lot of the research I did looked at internal campaign memos, they were noticing and responding to shifting public opinion.
And where can you talk to us about how this is sort of defined? In other words, what data could someone like Ronald Reagan look at in terms of determining that this was the shift in public opinion? Was it surveys about, do you want longer sentences? Do you want more mandatory minimums? Are you more or less in favor of the death penalty, for example? How can this public opinion, or how was it quantified?
Sure. And of course, politicians, by definition, are always trying to measure their constituents' preferences. And so some of this is conversation, some of this is letters that are sent, but they pay a lot of attention to the polls. So some of these are national polls being conducted by the main polling organizations. They're also conducting their own polls. And so when I looked at the presidential archives, former President Richard Nixon's archives, and the internal campaign memos, these memos by key members of his campaign staff were referencing the polls they conducted as well as polls they were reading about in the media. And they noticed that when asked what the public was concerned about, crime was rising to the top. And this differed from 1960 with Nixon's unsuccessful run for president.
We often hear this meme, and by calling it a meme, I don't mean to imply that it isn't true, but we hear this meme or idea or conventional wisdom that the war on drugs in many ways was related to the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and that it was incredibly racially tinged, and it was meant to target non-whites in the United States. Can you talk about the sort of interaction or the overlap between your findings and the war on drugs? I mean, could it be said that the public, by being more punitive during the period we've been talking about, was maybe primed to accept the beginning of the war on drugs?
Well, there's a few factors there. So one, you mentioned the racial implications of the war on drugs. And so all groups have not been treated equally. And some of this was actual legislation where the sentencing for an equal amount of crack cocaine versus powder cocaine, there's been major sentencing disparities. So the rate, and these have racial implications. The other point that relates to this is punitive public attitudes aren't independent of racial bias or racial views. And so race does creep into punitive public attitudes. One especially noteworthy finding, when I look at the public opinion data and shifts in how punitive the public is and the public demand for being tougher on crime, through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, all racial groups are getting more punitive. So this really illustrates the complexity of the issue, that racial bias matters. There's different racial groups have been affected very differently and unequally by the war on drugs. But there, across all segments of society, there was an increasing demand for being tougher on crime during the rise of the U.S. carceral state.
So let me see if I understand what you're saying. On the one hand, you're saying there's no doubt that different racial groups were affected differently by the punitive nature of the criminal justice system, the war on drugs, policing, prosecution rates, etc. But that at the same time, across racial groups, there was an increased desire for, or all racial groups were more punitive in terms of their desires.
That's exactly right. So we might think of this as the change in the criminal justice system in a more punitive direction was consistent with the rising punitiveness across different segments of society. But the outcomes, some of them might have been foreseen, others unintended consequences, have had very different implications for different racial and socioeconomic groups. And so the outcomes have, even if the responsiveness was to shift the criminal justice system in a more punitive direction and there was rising demand, the result of that has not been equivalent across society by any stretch.
In the book, you start to talk about the decline in the punitive nature of the American people more recently. And you mention that on paper, there has clearly been a decline in the crime rate. What else is your sense in terms of what has impacted public opinion on this issue over the last 15 or so years?
That's a great question. So as the crime rates declined since the late 90s, then again, we've got to keep the media in mind. And so media attention to the crime rate also declined. It's not as a front page issue or not on the nightly news as often. And this helps us understand why the public's become less punitive. And in this presidential race and in recent congressional discussions, we've begun to hear calls for criminal justice reform among both prominent Republicans and Democrats. And so I think this is evidence of both political parties noticing the shift in public attitudes and the beginning of a discussion about attempts for meaningful reform.
Well, it is fascinating. I'll remind the audience the book is Incarceration Nation, How the United States Became the Most Punitive Democracy in the World. We've been speaking with the book's author, Peter Enns, professor at Cornell University. Thanks so much for talking to us about this.
Thank you. Really, it's my pleasure.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Back in April of 2014, I told you the story of a lesbian couple that sued a sperm bank for giving them the sperm of a black man for their baby. The plaintiff in the case is Jennifer Cramblett, who is white, who gave birth to her mixed-race daughter, Peyton, about 3 years ago. And in her original lawsuit, she said the sperm bank's mix-up led to an unplanned transracial parent-child relationship for which I wasn't and continue not to be prepared. Cramblett was artificially inseminated with sperm that she ordered from an Illinois-based Midwest Sperm Bank. It was meant to be from donor number 380, a Caucasian man. And 5 months into the pregnancy, she found out the samples were switched. You had the sample from donor 330 as opposed to 380, who happens to be an African-American male. The sperm bank apologized. They gave Cramblett a refund for 6 vials of sperm, but that's it. And that initial lawsuit didn't really go anywhere. She now is filing another lawsuit. She has filed another lawsuit, and she is saying this is not at all about being racist or not loving my half-black daughter or anything like that. The issue here is that we live in a white, intolerant place. And we now have real costs associated with the fact that we don't want to stay here. And we now have to incur the costs of moving. We have to go to a more expensive place. We've been told, she says, that we should really be in counseling ourselves and in joint counseling with the daughter because we just were not prepared for this transracial parent-child relationship. And all of these things cost money. It's not about not liking black people. It's not about being racist. It's about the reality that they paid for a particular sperm sample, they got a different one, and now there are lifelong repercussions, so they claim. What do you think about this case?
I have no reason not to believe what she's saying.
Yep.
But what's sad about this is that, let's say the story sticks around, and it probably will if you are part of the story.
Right.
This child is forever going to be that kid whose mom sued the sperm bank because she had a black kid.
So you think the lawsuit is actually something that just could end up being damaging to the kid?
Well, if people remember it and know about it, and if the kid knows about it, it could be a source of confusion, frustration, anger. I don't know, but like I said, I have no reason not to believe the reasons for this lawsuit.
Yeah, I don't think for a second that it even matters whether this is out of racism or not. I happen to think it's not, but it doesn't actually matter. You're paying for a lot of control over the sperm sample you receive. It's not a random bag. You don't show up and they throw some sperm into a satchel and hand it to you and say, here you go. This is a controlled process, and it should eliminate these types of variables. And the reporting around this has been kind of shoddy, suggesting the parents are racist or they don't like the kid because the kid is black or some such nonsense. If you've ever been in a small, all-white, Midwestern or Southern town that may be quite intolerant, as they say, I wouldn't want to raise my biracial daughter there. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, it could very well be that getting out of there would be a great idea.
Send me your thoughts about this. Send me your thoughts about the lawsuit and the circumstances. And what do you think about what Lewis is saying, which is when the kid grows up and finds out your parents sued because you're black, what effect is that going to have on you, if any? Back in May of last year, I told you a story about a driverless truck corridor being proposed from Canada to Mexico. Some people got it, and some people angrily emailed me saying, David, this is a fantasy. Nothing like that will ever happen. 1 month later, in June of last year, I told you about $200,000 jobs that were being replaced operating trucks at mines in Canada with driverless trucks. It was happening, but still, I received a lot of angry emails, people not believing it or saying it's anecdotal. And now a series of, a convoy really, of self-driving trucks drove across Europe and arrived at the port of Rotterdam in the Netherlands. And estimates are that driverless trucks are not only here and growing, but they will actually be one of the biggest job automators in the current economy. Let's look at some of the numbers. Right now, if you look at shipping a whole truckload from LA to New York, you're talking about roughly $4,500. Labor is 75% of that $4,500. So the move to driverless trucks could save a lot of money. But in addition to that, it will speed up shipping because truck drivers are restricted by law from driving more than 11 hours per day without at least an 8-hour break. Driverless trucks can drive almost 24 hours per day. And for anybody saying, hey, hold on a second, David, this is going to kill millions of jobs, we have to stop this. How are you going to justify stopping technology that could reduce labor costs, not by 75% because you would have more truck maintenance because the trucks are driving more, et cetera, but some significant portion of 75%, while doubling efficiency because the trucks can be on the road about twice as much each day? It's going to be very tough to argue against that, isn't it?
Money drives everything. This isn't going to happen because it's a safety issue. It's not inevitable because it's the safety concerns. It's not inevitable for any other reason than money, and it's going to save a ton of money for a ton of companies.
And the savings could be even bigger because human drivers tend to get paid per mile for driving these long-haul trucks. So by definition, the faster you go, the more you make per hour. Driverless trucks can be configured to drive at more fuel-efficient speeds. Driving at 75 is not the fuel-efficient speed. So if you slow the trucks down, you're going to increase miles per gallon, and you're going to potentially save even more because the fuel costs will go down. Now, let's look at some of the counter arguments. One is you still need people, the truck drivers, to make sure that the cargo is secured and accounted for at the pickups and the drop-offs, et cetera. You can't really automate that. Maybe you can, maybe you can't, but you don't have to automate that, right? I mean, that's a separate issue from the driving. You can still have employees at the loading and unloading point. Another counter argument is, well, yeah, David, this could be easier on highways, but when you take a huge truck through narrow streets in big cities, et cetera, you need creative maneuvering. That's the type of thing that the AI is not going to be able to learn. Maybe, I would argue it probably will, but even still, you can still set it up so that the driverless trucks are doing the bulk of the transit. And then when you get into a city, that's where you have drivers that are operating, by the way, not on a mile per, cost per mile basis, which encourages arguably more erratic driving, but just people who are paid a salary or an hourly rate to get the trucks parked and to the loading bays. So I don't think, Lewis, there is any strong argument for how you are going to be able to prevent this unless you get a really strong lobbying effort of sorts. And as we know, that can be a big factor. It's prevented high-speed train development in many cases here in the U.S. This seems like a clear inevitability.
Yeah, it certainly is. And it's the inner city thing, that is an interesting point. But I don't see why AI would not be able to tackle that. And like you said, if it's just highway driving, that's still going to happen.
Last thing on this, Elon Musk has said he's the Tesla founder, one of the big problems is that a lot of these technologies rely on really well-marked roads in terms of lane lines, reflectors, speed limit signs, exit signs, all of these types of things. And that because a lot of American highways and roads are not in good shape, that is actually a problem. That's an argument to do some serious infrastructure spending because it's true, our highways are increasingly outdated in much of this country. That's a very solvable issue, not cheap, no doubt about it, but many politicians are already saying that we need to be doing that kind of work. I have a voicemail number, 219-2-DAVID-P, that you can call any day at all, any time of day. Take a listen to this voicemail.
Yeah, it seems like you don't know what Quaaludes are all about. When I was in high school, the high school kids would skip lunch and they'd walk a couple 100 feet down the road to the 7-Eleven. Mm-hmm. And behind the 7-Eleven, there was a guy that was selling Quaaludes. And they would buy Quaaludes. Okay? A Quaalude is something people take to get high. It's not a roofie. It's not a date rape drug. It's something people take because they want to get high.
Okay. So apparently this is related to the Bill Cosby story from yesterday.
Yeah.
And I guess the fact that when he was younger, people took Quaaludes to get high means Bill Cosby didn't ever do anything wrong. I mean, I'm not sure I understand the argument.
Yeah, we get that. We know what Quaaludes are. Heroin is something people take to get high too. And well, you can certainly take too much of that, and you can certainly take advantage of someone who is on that. And so,
not really proof of anything.
Not proof of anything at all. No.
On the bonus show today, Snapchat is lobbying for ballot selfies. Paris institutes a monthly car ban, and India mandates a panic button on all phones. DavidPakman.com/membership is how you sign up for instant access to the bonus show. Sign up today.
The David Pakman Show at DavidPakman.com.